On this day, the special day of St. Valentine, we thought we'd take a look at the history of wiping medieval asses. During the late Middle Ages, one of the most intimate courtiers, the groom of the stool, and when we say stool we don't mean something used for sitting on, was a thing. That got us thinking, and we realised that the history of bum wiping is quite fascinating, and we couldn't wait to share. So, happy Valentine's Day, and welcome to Bottom Mopping with Medieval Madness. Rough around the edges. From the beginning of civilization, we can only guess at the variety of natural tools used by humans for anal hygiene. Moss, feathers, leaves, grass, fur, sticks, their own hand, or possibly someone else's, have probably all been utilized at some point, as well as rinsing with water or snow. It's thought that the Minoans, a Bronze Age civilization from the Greek island of Crete, invented the very first flushing toilet around 4,000 years ago. To wipe themselves, the ancient Greeks used either pebbles, pessoi, or broken pieces of pottery called ostraka. In classical Athens, when a decision to banish a citizen was made, votes were cast by writing the name of the person to be exiled on a shard of ostraka. If the ballots went against one person in particular, then they were banished from the city for 10 years. This is where the term ostracism began. Researchers have suggested that the fragments from a vote may have been reused for derriere dabbing to insult the exiled person by soiling their name. Many pessoi have been found in both Greek and Roman toilets all around the Mediterranean. At the Agora, central public space in Athens, pessoi found there range from 3 to 10 centimeters in diameter and have smooth edges to minimize butt damage, although it's likely that long-term use of such coarse implements would have resulted in an extremely sore tushy and the likelihood of external hemorrhoids. A Greek wine cup dating from the 6th century BC was found in Orvieto, Italy. It shows a man squatting down to defecate with a cane in one hand to maintain his balance and a pebble in the other to clean his behind. An ancient Greek proverb emphasizes the benefits of being frugal by stating that, quote, 3 stones are enough to wipe one's ass. A sticky situation. Remains of Roman communal toilets can be found all across the former empire. It's thought that a sponge on a wooden stick was used for booty washing. Known as tersorium, the stick would be dipped into the water channel in front of the toilet, and then stuck through the keyhole-shaped hole beneath the latrine to clean the user's body. It was then washed and left to soak in a bucket of brine or vinegar before being reused. Not exactly the most hygienic idea. During the 1st century AD, the Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger reported that a Germanic gladiator died by suicide after hiding himself in the latrines of an amphitheater and then pushing the toilet stick down his own throat. Yeah, philosophize that, Seneca. Just sit with that and think about that for a little bit, Seneca. He wrote, quote, the stick on which a sponge is placed for the cleaning of stuck filth, he stuffed all the way into his throat. Pretty grim when you consider that the tersorium may also have been used similarly to the modern toilet brush today. Small pieces of cloth were found in a sewer in Herculaneum, Italy, one of the towns buried in 79 AD during the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It's possible that they were used for body wiping, although cloth was expensive and handmade at the time, so using it for posterior polishing would have been quite the extravagance. Get stickier. In China, there was a reference to the use of toilet paper as far back as the 6th century when the multi-talented politician Yan Zizhu wrote, quote, paper on which there are quotations and commentaries from the 5 classics or the names of sages I dare not use for toilet purposes. It's a shame he couldn't have got hold of some of the newspapers that are read today. During the later Tang dynasty in 851, an Arab traveller to China remarked that, quote, the Chinese do not wash themselves with water when they have done their necessities, but they only wipe themselves with paper. During the 14th century, 10 million packages of 1,000 to 10,000 sheets of toilet paper were manufactured annually in Zhejiang province alone. In 1393, during the Ming Dynasty, a yearly supply of 720,000 sheets of loo paper was made for use at the court in the capital Nanjing. Imperial records show that Emperor Hongwu's family used 15,000 sheets of specially produced extra soft paper, and that each sheet was perfumed. Not everyone was so enamored with toilet paper though. The 16th century French writer and humorist François Rabelais has one of his fictional characters, Gargantua, investigate several ways to wipe one's tokus after defecating. He tried everything from a lady's velvet mask, which gave him, quote, a most pleasant feeling in the fundament, to a, quote, March-born cat, but his claws ulcerated his whole perineum. He dismissed paper as the best form of cleanup because, quote, the Baloks always get a smear when paper's used to wipe the rear. Instead, Gargantua decided that, quote, there was no asswipe like a good downy gosling. When monks and missionaries brought Buddhism into China and Japan, they took the salaka, or shit stick, with them. The instrument was often cut from bamboo or other wood and resembled a spatula or scoop. The ends were wrapped in cloth and used to scrape away excrement. The sticks were popular as they were cheap and could be washed and reused. Archaeologists found some 2,000-year-old sticks in toilets in the town of Dunhuang in 1992. This was a Han Dynasty military base and relay station on the eastern end of the Silk Road. Traces of preserved fecal matter found on the cloth contained the remains of parasitic whipworm, tapeworm, roundworm, and Chinese liver fluke. Not just any old stool. During the Tudor period, the royal court rather than parliament was the most important political arena, and anybody who wanted to become a somebody needed to become a courtier rather than an MP. As one of His Majesty's closest courtiers, a man could rise to extraordinary heights of power and wealth. In his book, Henry, Virtuous Prince, the Tudor historian David Starkey explained how, quote, in 1493, Henry VII had broken with tradition and set up a new department of the royal household. Historically, there were two of these, the Lord Steward's Department, which provided food and drink, and the Lord Chamberlain's, which dealt with both ceremony and the king's personal service. To these, Henry added a third, the secret or privy chamber. This took over responsibility for the king's body service. It was also used, as its name indicates, to enforce a much more rigorous separation between the king's public and private lives. As the holder of the office of Groom of the Stool, no one could be closer to or more intimate with the king, as he was in charge of the monarch's commode or close stool and helped the king when he relieved himself. In the early days, the job entailed assisting the king to remove his clothing before sitting on his chiffonier, but more than likely meant that he wiped and washed the royal backside as well. As the king and his entourage often travelled from palace to palace and spent a lot of time visiting the homes of his wealthier subjects, arrangements needed to be put in place for the custody of the stool or chair itself. A suitable private room needed to be found where curtains could be hung and washing utensils such as a water bowl and towels could be provided. This was usually close to the king's bedroom, where the gentlemen of his privy chamber were nearby. Undressing and redressing a monarch was no easy task either, especially in winter when clothing was thick and heavy and often had complicated fastenings. The man chosen by Henry VII for this most intimate of roles had to be someone he could wholeheartedly trust, someone who he felt comfortable with and could confide in. He chose a man named Hugh Denys, whose grandfather was a knight. Denys married well, and he not only helped Henry Tudor with his ablution, but rose to become the king's treasurer. According to Starkey, from the time of the, quote, establishment of the secret chamber, this greatly expanded the groom's importance and his portfolio. Denys became the head officer of the new department. He controlled access to the king and assumed responsibility for the king's everyday necessities. Denys became the king's personal treasurer, running an account that later became known as the Privy Purse. When Tudor's son Henry VIII came to the throne, he gave the job of bum wiper-in-chief to his great friend Sir William Compton. Never to be outdone, he also had 6 esquires of the body who got the king up at 8 AM, helped him to change his vest and underpants, and put him back to bed at night. They also helped him to eat. The office became redundant after first Mary and then Elizabeth I came to power. The final groom of the stool was likely Michael Stanhope, who served Edward VI, their brother. Stanhope was hanged for felony before Edward's death. Under the Stuarts, the position was adapted to that of Groom of the Stole, a role more about dressing the monarch than toileting him. the great necessity of the age. Most medievals used chamber pots and were probably happy enough with a handful of straw or moss to remove any rear-end remains. Into the 18th century, some who could afford to carried books with them for the dual purpose of reading and wiping, like the Friend of Lord Chesterfield. In 1747, he wrote a letter to his son explaining how an acquaintance, quote, bought a common edition of Horace, of which he tore off gradually a couple of pages, carried them with him to that necessary place, read them first, and then sent them down as a sacrifice to Closina. Closina being the goddess who presided over the greatest drain of the sewer system in Rome. Apparently, she even had a cult too, along with a shrine. Who knew? It wasn't until 1857 that New Yorker Joseph Gaiety marketed a medicated paper for the water closet that modern loo roll became commercially available. It was advertised as a necessity rather than a luxury, and Gaiety claimed that printed paper contained numerous chemicals that could poison tender portions of the body. The English patent for the loo paper appeared in 1880, but it wasn't until 1936 that the soft version was developed. Through the 20th century in England, many people used squares of newspaper for wiping, which they hung from a hook in the outside lavatory. In the US, dried corn cobs were popular during the 1700s, but the Americans also turned to newspapers and magazines later. Published continually since 1792, the Farmer's Almanac was the popular choice for hanging on a hook in the outhouse, so much so that the company began to pre-drill a hole in the corner of the handbook just to make it easier to hang. People today don't know how lucky they are when it comes to having a clean tushy. We have indoor plumbing, toilets, and bidets. For those who like to wipe, the choice of polishing materials is crazy. There are moist bum wipes, cushioned toilet rolls, quilted toilet rolls, scented and lotioned toilet rolls. Rolls imbued with coconut oil, aloe vera, or even vanilla. Even raspberry and rhubarb or sugar plum toilet rolls. You could say that we have finally reached the pinnacle of butthole hygiene. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. If you have been watching this whilst on the toilet, please do wash your hands. Seriously, I'm looking at you, Alex. And do subscribe if you enjoyed the video, as we're back every Friday with a new one. Until then, hope everyone has an awesome week. Cheers!